Hello and welcome to the Wheeler Centre. I'm Alexandra de Blas and I'm joined by Paul Hawken. And I'd like to begin today by acknowledging the traditional owners of the country that we're on, the Wurundjeri people, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past and present. Well, this is a joint event between the Wheeler Centre and the Australian Conservation Foundation, and the ACF does a fabulous job working with the public, government and business to keep the environment safe and healthy. And do check out their website on acfonline.org.au. But now I'd like to introduce Paul, and it's wonderful to have you here with us in Melbourne, all the way from San Francisco. And as you may know, and that's why you're here, Paul is an environmental luminary, an author, and also an entrepreneur, and he's dedicated much of his life to sustainability and changing the relationship between business and the environment. Paul writes about the impact of commerce on living systems and consults to heads of government, CEOs on economic development, industrial ecology and environmental policy. He started and run a number of businesses, including some of the first natural food companies in the US that used sustainable agricultural methods. He currently heads up One Sun, an energy company focused on ultra-low-cost solar based on green chemistry and biomimicry. He also runs Highwater Global, a social impact public equity fund. And to put that in Australian terms, Highwater keeps the bastards honest in the socially responsible investment space. Paul's written 7 books, and 4 of them were national bestsellers, and The Ecology of Commerce is famous for triggering the environmental epiphany of Ray Anderson, the CEO of Interface Carpets, who then went on to transform his multinational carpet company to become a model of sustainable business. Bill Clinton was highly impressed with his subsequent book, Natural Capitalism, Creating the Next Industrial Revolution, which Paul co-authored with Amory and Hunter Lovins, and the President called it one of the 5 most important books in the world today. But I'd like to begin with Blessed Unrest, how the largest movement in the world came into being and why nobody saw it coming. Having just stood metres away from the police dismantling the Occupy Melbourne protest yesterday with their horses and dogs, your book seems incredibly prescient. Tell me about Blessed Unrest and what makes this movement that you're talking about different from ones that have gone before.
Thank you for the question. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. I wasn't the broadcaster on ABC, and I'm a writer. I'm not nearly as eloquent and poised and well-spoken as Alexandra, but thank you so much. I was also there yesterday in the demonstration. I had a talk at the town hall, and they had moved them, the Lord Mayor had moved them away from the front of the town hall to the city square and the intersection. They occupied the intersection twice and were pushed back the second time by dogs and horses, and worse. For me, I felt right at home. I was dressed like this, unfortunately, kind of in drag, and I just wanted to join them. But I did notice something there, which I saw in Seattle '99, see in demonstrations now, which is you had a group of people who were standing there, I think had been there for many days, not overnight, but just coming back and sort of witnessing. There was a kind of a real presence they had, and they weren't moving around and they weren't saying so much, talking to each other. And then there was a younger group of people that were kind of fierce and angry and running around yelling and screaming and so forth. And sort of been attracted to it, and were really, fierce. And I think Occupy, the movement, I know some of the original people who Occupy, you can't say the organizers, but because it wasn't organized in the traditional way, and that's really it goes right to the heart of your question. And when I wrote Blessed Unrest, it was really based on my experience in 1999 at the WTO protests in Seattle. And I had gone there not as a writer, but just as somebody who loved to sit down and get arrested. And which I did happily, and most of the people around me were very, very young. It was like their first direct action. And I took no notes. I didn't go there with a camera notebook. And then when I left and went to Washington D.C. that weekend to give a talk, I read the Times, the Washington Post, New York Times, Washington Post, LA Times, and I read these columns like Tom Friedman and others. People hadn't been there, and apparently they knew a lot about what happened because there were these huge stories about Seattle, what it meant, and the purple-haired, 60s hippies trying to get their fix, from. And it was just so off, and so revealing of the media, and it's rushed to judgment, even in the face of ignorance, and so I wrote a 10,000-word piece. And sent it on email, and it was eventually published in 27 magazines around the world, but called N30. And the reason I wrote it was because I thought, gosh, those young people were going back to college, and their parents were going to read this direct that was in Time and Newsweek and so forth, and thought, well, this is what my children were doing, and that's not what they were doing at all. And the same thing holds true for Occupy. And the thing that I wanted to know about Seattle was, okay, but how is it organized? Because it was organized exactly the same, which is there's no head, you couldn't find the command, control headquarters, you couldn't find the charismatic male vertebrate, who could proudly sit back and take credit for it, And this is so refreshing, because in my work prior to that, in civil rights and anti-war, it was really top-down, it was hierarchical, it was like force versus force. And here you were with people organized in a very different way, and the reason, both in New York and maybe yesterday, I don't know, but certainly in Seattle, the reason there was so much brutality, I think, is the police became very frustrated because you couldn't find the neck, you couldn't find the backbone, you couldn't find the nervous system, you couldn't find the head to chop off, and no matter what you did, it just re-arose. And so what in researching it, what I discovered is that the organizational meme of Seattle, which I believe is the same as Occupy, in fact I know it is, came from the Zapatistas. And that method of organization came from the Encuentras, which were in 1987 and 1992, and they're the first time that the indigenous people of North America, Mesoamerica, and South America had gotten together since the Holocaust of 1492, also known as the discovery of America by Europeans, but much to the surprise of the 110 million people who were already there. And those meetings were brought about to stop the celebration of the Holocaust, which is what was going to happen in the 500th anniversary. And they organized themselves in a way that really is Mayan in origin. So here you have these Encuentros in 87, 92, and the Zapatistas, you go to Seattle. And what I was saying in Blessed Unrest is that you have a movement arising in the world that doesn't have a name, that is non-ideological, that is ubiquitous, that is everywhere, and very much impelled by a new generation of people who grew up communicating in a very lateral way, not in a top-down way. And that's because of the internet, and because of all the different ways, not just Facebook and Twitter, but all the different ways in which my children, for example, have interacted and grew up. I mean, my son was there with his earphones, chatting and texting and doing homework and playing video games, listening to Green Day all at the same time. I'm going, all right, if it works for you. I mean, and it did work for them in a way that we maybe cannot understand, but it's working extraordinarily in terms of whether it's the Arab Spring or whether it's Occupy around the world, because it's a different form of organization.
When I first read Blessed Unrest in 2007, I felt inspired and hopeful, but a little bit sceptical about, okay, there is no leader, there's this movement. Yeah. How is it actually going to make a difference? Right. But I just feel in, the last year, things have really changed. As you mentioned, the Arab Spring, when we look financially, the disruption of the financial system in Europe and the US, and Gaddafi died yesterday, and London riots, Occupy Wall Street, and environmentally climate change is intensifying extreme weather events, and we're hitting limits on every front, whether it be oil, water, arable land, coral reefs, population.
Mm-hmm.
So could the scale of this whole system collapse, which is imminent, be the catalyst that helps this movement actually seize the opportunity to make a better future for our children?
Well, it was perilous even to call it a movement, because, you know, when you say a movement, you say, well, what movement? And who started it, and where to begin, and who's in charge, and, you know, where's the headquarters, and where's the literature, and all that. So as soon as you say movement, so when I say unnamed movement, I said it in default, which is, I'm not sure what this is called, and I'm not sure what a good noun would be. And the reason I think it's arising is because it's arising out of default. And I use a metaphor which I think is very accurate, which is this is humanity's immune response to ecological degradation, political corruption, and economic disease. And we know it. It's ubiquitous. It's all around us. And there's certain, people are tolerant to a certain extent, you know, and say, politics, you know, these are bankers, this is, you know. At a certain point, you say, enough. And it happens, and the reason there's so many organizations is because they arise, again, by default, in a place, in a city, in a tribe, in a culture, in a jungle, someplace, because the authority, the governing organization that we would expect to turn to regulate, to prevent, to stop, to prevent, to secure, to save, to protect us, does not, because it's corrupt. And that is when, you know, people rise up, and that corruption can take many forms, not just the, you know, Swiss bank account, you know, stuffing your pockets full of money corruption. There's a corruption I saw in Western Australia, which is the Premier there forbids anybody to use climate change in any of the literature or discussions by anybody in the government, including the head of the botanical garden. Well, give me a break. That's corruption. It's the corruption of humanity. It's the lack of transparency, lack of openness, lack of truthfulness, lack of opinion, lack of free speech. So corruption takes many, many forms. You can read about my country. It takes myriad forms in my country. We're experts at it. And so it arises that way. And so what's so brilliant about it, you know, is that it's not, I don't know anything more about it than you do, or you. You know, I've just sort of held a mirror up to it and said, what do you see? This is what I'm seeing. You know, tell me what you see, because it's the one type of organization that a government cannot quash, an army cannot kill, the media or Rupert Murdoch cannot get rid of, because you can't put your hand on it. You can't take away its tax exemption. You can't, you know, defund it. You know, and so there's a brilliance in the way humanity is doing this, you know, that maybe even itself doesn't fully understand, you know. And so that's what's so lovely about it, you know. And really the other thing is how many. It's just astonishing.
What sort of numbers are we talking about?
Well, actually, somebody sent, Richie, can you run I didn't know this was here, but it's here. It's on his computer, and he's going to run it. It's a tape. And to give you a sense of how many organizations there are, you know, you're seeing just a random list of organizations here from different parts of the world. And they're environmental organizations, social justice organizations, and indigenous organizations. To give you a sense of how many there are, and I mean a visceral sense, not just a numerical sense, that we would have to stay here all day and all night here on Saturday, and all day tomorrow and all night for 24 hours, and then all day Monday and Tuesday and Wednesday, and watching this, and we would still be here next Saturday. And next Saturday I'd come and say, God, you guys are so patient, can you stay another week? And then we watch it for another week, and I come back sheepishly and say, you know, you're not very far yet, actually. Can you stay another 2 weeks? And it'll be another 2 weeks, and after a month I come back here and say, can you stay one more month? And after that month, you will have seen the names of all the organizations in the world that are working on behalf of the environment and social justice, women, you know, climate, indigenous rights in the world. That's how big we are, you know. it's extraordinary. You know what? Again, the only way I think we're going to heal this world is to become we. And we don't need heroes. We need humane people, humanity. Heroes kind of messed it up, you know. And so, by the way, I shortened this so we could go on, you know. And my friend who made this was a big fan of Star Wars, so you're going to see it at the end, you know, just rah, you know. So you're going to see all 2 million right now, but again, this is something that when I was writing the book, you know, I just felt like, well, why aren't we talking about this? And you know, why is it? And it kind of makes sense in a way. It's under the radar of privilege, and right, we are in a world organized by privilege, controlled by privilege, dominated by privilege, and we're moving to a world that is truly bottom-up, organized by community. And it's a very, very different world that we're moving to. Yeah.
Well, climate change is one of the climate change is one of the key drivers that's moving us to that different world. And scientists warn we've got less than a decade if we want to curb runaway global warming. But the skeptics seem to be becoming more politically powerful than ever before, particularly in Australia and the US. So how do you see the contest over the science unfolding?
Well, I mean, the skepticism, the rising of the deniers, is to me what I call the sunset effect. You know, when just before the sun sets, there's this brilliant kind of display of color and light, you know, and then it gets dark, and so it's often what you see at the end of a paradigm, end of a kind of a tightly held worldview that doesn't want to be given up, is that it becomes more shrill as the news becomes worse. And so that's what you're seeing, you know, is this, it's in relationship to the amount of information and news we have, and so I don't pay much attention to it really. You know, we had in our country this terrible belittling and of homosexuality and lesbian and gay rights and particularly marriage between consenting gay couples, and the right wing seized upon it. It became an election issue. It became, you know, things were passed in state legislatures which are turned down by the, you know, judicial system. But it was really like you know, what happened? This rise of hate and fear mongering and then it's evaporating, and all the armed services said, "Forget about it. Don't, you know, you're in. Come on in. We want gay people." And Mayor Bloomberg married gay people on the steps of New York City, you know, town hall, and away it's gone. And just state after state after, so it's just passing legislation and say, and I don't know what happens, you know, when you get this sort of tipping point, critical mass, and so forth. And so the same thing's going to happen with climate. That I'm not concerned about. What I'm concerned about is what we're going to do, not about what the last few holdouts say in the media.
Yeah, but, you know, if we've got this, you know, really intense 10-year time frame to really move, and, you know, climate change has become a dirty word even in the Obama administration, and here in Australia, if Tony Abbott gets elected next time, which looks very likely, he will completely dismantle the carbon tax legislation. So how do we get past the politics to ensure that we keep moving forward? Yeah, well, the first thing we do is stop looking for love in all the wrong places, and that's at the top. And the idea that somehow governance is going to lead the way is such a delusion. Never have before and never will. You know. We certainly welcome whenever we have a more enlightened leader. We haven't, but we would certainly welcome that. And a literate Congress, that would be just joyful.
I mean, literate. Scientifically literate would be even more joyful. But, I just think we have to stop looking towards, Parliament or Congress and and Canberra and in Washington D.C. Saying, come on. It's a waste of time. We have to do this ourselves. And one of the things you see robustly in the world today was the take-up by municipalities all over the world of the Kyoto Protocol and surpassing it and adopting it and working with citizens and all sorts of children, education and the agencies and business and so forth. And that is an ongoing thing. It's very robust here in Melbourne, and it's really emblematic of what we're seeing in terms of, well, we can't look to our state and federal governments. We have to look to that first order of sovereignty in the world, which is a town, a city, and that's where that was the first time sovereignty existed in civilization. Was in these larger communities we call city towns, or and so I'm very hopeful about governance in that sense, because it's a scale in which we can participate and have impact and work together and listen to each other and make a difference. And that's why, again, Occupy is very important, because it's really on the municipal level. It's in towns all over. So but I also think that I don't think this 10-year thing. I don't buy that. We already failed that one. That deadline, we passed the deadline. Climate change is not a threat any longer. It's here. We don't have to worry about it being a threat. It's here, so 10 years, 20 years, 5 years, those goals, that was 1980, we said we had 20 more years,
it's here, but what about, they talk about 2 degrees, but that we have to take a certain amount of action to ensure that we don't go beyond that. Well, I'm sure we'll go beyond 2 degrees, but really it gets worse and worse. We do have to respond rapidly.
Unquestionably. We have to reduce our carbon emissions by 80% in the next 25 years. And in order to have even a ghost of a chance of capping at 450 ppm and 2 degrees, and that assumes that some of the positive feedback loops that are seemingly coming into play right now in the tundra and the methane and the oceans do not become, full-blown. And in order to do that, and this is a fun exercise, I encourage all of you to do it, which is, and you can just do it on the back of a napkin or your computer. It's a fun parlor game, which is to figure out what we have to do, literally, in terms of energy. And you can start with what we use, which is 16 terawatts a year in energy equivalents, 16 trillion watts. And then divided by people, 7 billion on October 31st, so that's 2,296 watts or whatever it is, per person, 2,300 watts. And then you have to look at all the sources of existing energy, primarily coal and natural gas and, oil and nuclear, and then there's hydro and a little bit of biofuel and a little tiny little thing there called solar. And on the bottom, it just barely shows up. And then say, okay, what do we have to do in the next 25 years? And you can run the math any way you want, but roughly it's 200 square meters of 15% solar PV every second for 25 years, and 50 square meters of solar mirror for solar thermal every second for 25 years, and 1 Olympic-sized swimming pool of biodiesel algae every second for 25 years, and 1 3 megawatt wind turbine every 6 hours for 25 years, and 1 100 megawatt geothermal plant every day for 25 years, and 1 3 gigawatt nuclear power plant every week for 25 years. That's it. And that assumes we don't increase the amount of energy that we're using on the world, even though 2 billion more people are coming, and people who are here want more energy. So there's the...
Is that using the technology that exists right now?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So what you're suggesting is we have to change our technology.
Well, no. I'm just saying is, given what we have, that's what we'd have to do. What I would say is that if you look at renewable technologies, And what's interesting is that we think they're new, but they're really old. LEDs go back to 1870, the diodes, the invention of the diode. Wind turbines, hard to say really, how many thousands of years. Solar PV goes back to the 50s, Bell Labs for the Department of Defense and satellites. And then you have electric cars. I mean, the taxi fleet in New York City was electric in 1910. So what happened when we became aware that we had to move towards non-carbon-based forms of electricity and energy is that we went into the past, actually. And what is happening is it took a while for the universities and academics and engineers and entrepreneurs to kind of basically take it as seriously as they do right now in terms of invention. And I would say that there's just a tsunami, a wave of technologies that are coming in the next 10 years that are astonishing. And they're not tweaking the old technologies. They're actually de novo, clean sheet, reimagining really how to make energy, how to store energy, extraordinary in their efficiency and their return on energy. And so on that technical level, I'm very, very hopeful. And I've said something in listservs and so forth when people have talked about, well, we're getting behind, we're falling behind, and the deniers, and they seem to be winning, and ClimateGate, and and our leaders like Obama are afraid to talk about it, and shush it behind them. And I feel like we as citizens really haven't had the tools yet that we need in order to make this change. And yes, we can retrofit our houses and insulate and do a lot in terms of energy efficiency, which is the cheapest form of energy. But I just feel like the tools and the components and the ability for people to implement clean, safe, renewable energy around the world in very accessible, affordable, non-subsidized ways that are cheaper than coal and cheaper than grid parity are coming, and they're coming soon. And I think you're going to see an asymptote, really, in terms of the capacity and ability of the world to change. Right now, the technologies we have scale very, very poorly in terms of the amount of money they take for capital investment and time. They don't scale well.
So that's really exciting to know that that's coming in 5, 10 years, whatever.
Or less.
Right. But what do we do now? Should we...
Everything.
Yeah.
Everything you can do.
Yeah.
I mean, again, and Bill Clinton talks about this, the most effective form of energy, the cheapest form of energy, the kind of energy that employs the most people and costs the least to achieve is efficiency, is retrofitting our building stock. There's no question about it. And whether they're historic buildings like the Wheeler Center or new buildings or those in between, it is just a gold mine of energy, of job creation. And the problem with it really is that I say we're moving from, in a sense, a CapEx world to an OpEx world. We're moving from a world where everybody's concerned about first cost. But then operating costs was like, not my problem. And the thing is, the investment in building efficiency and retrofitting has a real return on capital, a lot better than you get in this, savings account. And somehow we have to monetize it, hook it up in a way that we can benefit from just pouring our money into retrofitting the city of Melbourne and the city of San Francisco, because the returns are fantastic in every way. And so I think it's more like we need a monetary or economic instrument to do that, and it's so interesting because we're so ingenious at making monetary instruments that are absolutely bizarre. $60 trillion of, counterparty CDOs around the world that are just up there ready to fall on us like a big stone. And those were created by our financial institutions and traded, as if it was a casino. And yet this monetary instrument where we can start trading, basically. So I can invest in that building over there, and the savings that either the landlord or the tenant gets then is monetized back to an instrument that I have bought. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. You know, this is not complicated. And the problem is that, you know, you just make a reasonable return on your capital, and that, it seems like that's not what people want. Not us, but I mean the financial community. And that's what we need, is ways for us to put in $100 or $1,000, you know, from our retirement fund or our savings or whatever, and put into something that's going to pay us, you know, 5, 6, 7% for, you know, 15, 20 years, and have a huge impact on energy and environment and job creation, comfort. You know, those are possible.
One of the biggest obstacles to change is the economic system, which you've just been talking about, which rewards infinite growth in a world of finite resources. So you say what we're doing right now isn't really capitalism.
Yeah.
Why isn't it? Explain that.
Well, I mean, you see people saying, you know, they're against the capitalist system. I wish it was there to be against, you know, in a sense. I don't know what it is. A capitalist system preserves capital invested and lives off income. Well, that's capitalism. And what we do is liquidate our capital, and we steal it from the future generations, sell it now, call it GDP, pat ourselves on the back, and call it capitalism. And it is not remotely close to capitalism in a pure sense of the word. And so I think it'd be interesting if we tried it and see how it goes. You know, right now we're in liquidation mode. We're liquidating the earth, right? We're having this once-in-a-billion-year blowout sale of carbons, you know. No, you know, reasonable offers refused, you know. And if we can't find them, then we'll frack our way to them, you know. And any form we can get them, and if it pencils out, you know, they're available for sale. And but it's not just carbon, you know. I mean, we're selling off our fisheries, our forests, our topsoil, our future. Basically, we're robbing our children's children. It's larceny. And there is no reason why we cannot create the monetary instruments to heal the future, to create capital of the future, the restoration of the future, and have jobs now doing that and return a sufficient amount of capital on that investment, because we're investing in the future to pay people living wages to do that now. And the example I've used, and I think you heard this yesterday, was this company called Zynga in the United States, and they have a market value of $2.5 billion. And what they did was create Farmville. That's it. Farmville. Some of you know what it is. It's nothing. It's just a virtual world on Facebook where you can have chooks and, you know, grow wheat and sell land and, you know, do all sorts of stuff, but it has a $2.5 billion value. So I'm not decrying that so much as I'm saying is the economy is just entirely, we make it up. It's made up. It's totally imaginary. The idea that there's rules or that economics is a science, with all due respect, you know, it just isn't true, you know? And so the question is, well, let's make something up. What do we want to do? You know, rather than saying, oh, okay, well, it doesn't pencil out. Well, you know, it doesn't make money. Says who?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, what sort of drivers should we be putting in place so we actually design things to last and to be used, rather than building obsolescence in and creating a situation where we encourage innovation and learning from nature and indigenous cultures? You know, think of Australian Aborigines who are here around here for 40,000 years. So they had a few things going right. So how could we set capitalism to work for us so we actually driving us to get where we need to go?
It's so funny you should mention recycling, because this morning I read the Australian, and I love to read Murdoch's papers, and I was reading and I saw this picture of Sarkozy. He just apparently just had a baby, but but even though he didn't have a baby, his wife had a baby, but I mean, they had a baby, and he was, the picture of him was standing in a recycling center, and there was this huge pile of trash, and it was really trash, unsorted trash. And I looked at it and go, this is so stupid. We didn't design our world to be recycled, and nature did. And so he's standing in this trash thinking, this is the future? And you're like, this is, no, it's not. And so when we think of recycling, which is absolutely right, of course, but I mean, I'm saying is, can we imagine designing our objects and what we use in a way that their recycling, reuse is so elegant? So right now it's just a mess, really. And because it's an add-on, it was tacked onto it. But when we think of indigenous people, and I was struck by last night, the introduction to the talk I gave in Mornington by Auntie Carolyn, and Bunurara clan, what do you say? I'm sorry. Huh? Bunurara, but is it tribe or clan or?
Well, it's a big language group.
A language group, thank you.
Part of the Kulin Nation.
Yeah, but you say, okay. Yeah, okay, but we're just so struck by she and then her, the dance and what was being expressed, before the evening began, and it came to mind. What came to mind is that that in Western civilization, this, and even in the sustainability movement, particularly, in fact, we think of sustainability as something that we do for nature, to nature, on behalf of nature. To save nature, and to me, as lovely as that is, and intention and desire, it's at the very core of the problem. And the core of the problem is that we think we're not nature. I mean, and what we find in indigenous cultures is languages and mores and customs and rituals and poetry and song and blessings, where there is no syntax for that separation. There is no, it's not in the nervous system. Well, no wonder it was confusing when, they and Darwin and other people met, and because such a different way of looking at ourselves, and the way when you look at yourself separate from nature, it's so anxiety promoting, it's so lonely, and no wonder you shop. And no wonder it never satisfies, and vanity never satisfies, and clothes don't satisfy, and sex doesn't satisfy, and TV doesn't satisfy, and food doesn't satisfy. Nothing will satisfy you if you're alone. And so the promise of this, and the reason I mentioned the sort of convergence of indigeneity and social and environmental justice together in this movement is really it's that healing of that deep wound we have of anomie, of feeling separate from who we are, and when we have that kind of awakening, because it really is an awakening, it's an experience. I say we can't change things by solving problems. We solve problems by changing us, ourself, our core self, our heart, and when we address that wound and see it and heal it and so forth, then we what is possible is unlimited. I don't mean in a superhero sort of way, but I mean just in terms of our heart and spirit. I mean this, and that's the promise of this awakening in humanity that we see worldwide in this movement, which is, and this kindness, this generosity. Because if you see the world as you would your child or your sister, as part of you, as integral to you, as like your hands and feet, how can you harm it? How can you hurt it? How could you do anything that would be harmful? And then how can you not love it? And then how do you express that love? And it's easy to sit down in front of a bulldozer and stop and say, no, not angry, but just never, ever, ever think about harming what's behind me, And so the courage and the ability to act, comes from this resolution of this duality that we were taught. Children don't have it. It takes, 10, 12, 14 years and hundreds of thousands of dollars to teach children that they're separate from nature.
Just briefly, I'd like to touch on the idea of the city as an organism.
Oh, yeah. Well...
And the innovation that comes from cities and the potential you see for cities to help with this transformation.
There's a wonderful scholar, Jeffrey West, a physicist at Santa Fe Institute, and he's been studying cities and the metabolism of organisms, species, cities, and corporations, and it's so interesting, the three. I see cities as organisms, like Baudelaire did as well, and living things, as opposed to a place made up of living things and objects and structures. And what he said is, if you look at how organisms scale, they're sublinear. That is to say, every 4x in size, there's a 3x increase in energy. So they get more efficient in terms of energy the bigger they get. But they also get slower. So, hummingbird is 1,260 heartbeats per minute, and we're 60, 70, or what have you, and the tortoise is 12 to 14. And we live 70 years, and a hummingbird lives 2, and the tortoise... There was a tortoise in Queensland that was born in 1827 and brought to Australia on the HMS Beagle, named Harriet. And Harriet died in 2002 at 175, in Queensland. I think it's because she got tired of the Bush administration, I'm not sure. She just gave it up, so I'm out of here. But you see this relationship between age and metabolism. But when you go to cities, you see that sublinear relationship, which is, the bigger the city gets, the less material and energy it uses per capita. The less per capita. But you see the opposite in terms of metabolism, which is, as the city gets bigger, it gets quicker, it gets faster. You get more ideas, more productivity, more patents, more art, more poems, more music. We get more brilliant in cities. We really do. And what's interesting about that is, if you compare that to a corporation, corporations are the opposite, which is, as they grow, productivity, ideas, and innovation are sublinear. Not in a city, for every one increment in size, you get 115. Get 15% more idea, ideation, imagination, and so forth. Companies go the other way, and they get to a certain size, and they're just dead in the water, and they disappear. So companies always die. But you can bomb a city with a nuclear weapon, which we did, tragically, and it's still there. Cities are unbelievable. So cities, to me, are organisms where, again, this collective wisdom of humanity is that we're moving to cities at the rate of 1.4 million per week all over the world. And we see cities as the source of the problem, the source of the impact, the source of population growth. But it's the other way around. The number one cause of birth control in the world is cities. Because populations plummet when people from rural areas move to the city, and along with women's rights and education and economic opportunity, they stop population growth dead in its tracks. And so what I think we're seeing worldwide is, in a sense, humanity moving to cities as sort of ecological, biological arks, in which we can sort of, work our way through this flood of stupidity that we created, and create the mechanisms for not only to survive it, but to restore and ameliorate the damage we've caused. So I see cities in a very unusual way, obviously. Yeah. I love this city. Walking from my hotel and seeing the Princess Theatre with its filigree and gold leaf lions and scalloped shale shingles and and stained glass windows, and oh my gosh, you guys have a fantastic city.
Look, I'm just about to throw the discussion open, but I just wanted to ask one more thing before I do. And you went to Greenland on a royal investigation tour. I'm not exactly sure what it was called.
Fact-finding.
Fact-finding mission, that's right. Tell me about that. It's fascinating.
Well, that was done. That was the Princess of Sweden, Victoria, the Prince of Denmark, Frederick, and the Prince of Norway, Hawken, Haakon, not my name, all got together, and they're the crown prince and princesses. That is to say, they're going to become the kings and queens of their respective countries, where there's a great deal of respect for these people. And wanted to know about climate change, and they invited 5 scientists and a journalist, and I guess they thought I was a journalist, but because they knew I wasn't a scientist, and we went to the north of Greenland, to the North Greenland Eemian Ice Research Center, and extraordinary trip, because you take off from Kongalusik in these C-130s from the Schenectady National Guard in America, and those little military planes you see in movies, where there's netting and you're sitting, and if you want to pee, it's in a 5-gallon plastic bucket behind a curtain. It's like that's the bathroom, and really, really terrible food, and you land in the north of Greenland in an area at the ice station where you're 500 kilometers from any known human artifact, and I'm talking about any known artifact, a candy bar wrapper. There's just nothing there. I mean, as soon as you get out of the plane, you know why there's nothing there, because there's nothing there. I mean, there's not even a rock. It's ice as far as you could go and see, and whiteouts and winds and storms and so forth. And there's tents and a geodesic dome, and in the middle of it there's this ice cave that goes down 6 stories, steps carved out of the ice, and labs and cold labs and generators and lights, and it's really like a science fiction movie, I gotta tell you. And very perilous to be there. You'll be there 90 days, and you got to get out. You won't survive. Planes can't get in, you can't get out. And they've been going there for years and years. And their purpose was to go down to the Eemian period, which is 125,000 years ago. And that's the last time it was 450 parts per million of CO2, right? And they did just after, not long after we left. But while we're there, they pull out these ice cores, and they come out from 6 stories down. They come up, and they're very long as maybe the floor to ceiling here. And they bring them up, and they put them horizontally, and they're covered with coconut milk. Why they use coconut milk? They can't use any mineral oil. They have to use a vegetable, and it works the best. And it's all white and bubbling, and and steam is coming off of the heat, and this ice core is just so interesting. And they take these probes and they go on it, and they can go over it, and they have these screens, LCD screens, where they read out, and they can read it so well now. They can tell you exactly what was happening in that year. This is 1328. What you're seeing here is a southern hemispheric volcano of tremendous proportion. The sulfur aerosols are primarily concentrated in the south, but there's and this and this and this, and it's amazing what we have learned to do in terms of having this forensic ability to go back in our climatic history and understand what it was like. What we know about that period is that London was underwater. It was a swamp. More interestingly was that the hippopotamus that were there, full of hippopotami, and that lions and zebras and hyenas and were prancing around Germany, and alligators were munching in Alaska. I mean, this is 4:50 p.m., which will be ppm, which will be at in 39 years. Now, we won't be in that climate regime at that time, but that is what 450 ppm resulted in eventually. And it came much more slowly in the Eemian period than it is now. So what we can expect is a tremendous amount. I've always thought climate change was just a wimpy word. It's extreme climatic volatility is where we're going towards. And that's the proper term. Change sounds good. We all want to change, and so it was an extraordinary trip, and it give me such a profound profound appreciation for the valor of the scientists. The week before, one of the people who've been there for 10 years got caught out in slightly underdressed and did something that you should never do and wandered away trying to find himself back to base camp and was left out overnight and is a double amputee. And I mean, they're right there on the edge of survival, and underfunded, overworked, and from 14 countries, and high esprit de corps, working on his behalf. So when I hear, you know, the Rick Perrys of my country, or the Tony Abbotts and all that sort of stuff, you know, just sort of, you know, blithely dismissing, you know, the science, you know. I just wish we could strap them into the C-130 and take them up there and see what they say when they come back, you know. Or leave them there, yes.
Well, I'd like to now open up the floor here to all of you, and there's a microphone on either side, and I would just say your name and off you go. So we'll start over here on the left.
Firstly, Paul, thank you so much for your vision, your inspiration, and the nourishment that you've brought. Thank you sincerely, ladies and gentlemen. And thank you also especially for your sunset effect. It's so reinforcing, it's so validating. And as you may know, Mahatma Gandhi, he's a famous fellow from the past. Mahatma Gandhi once said that in the beginning, they ignore you.
Right.
Then they laugh at you. Then they fight. And then you win.
Yeah.
And I think that is a resonance of your sunset effect, and I think it's so important because we need not be distracted by all of that irrelevant hullabaloo that's going on. And if I may share also something from really quickly. Yes, the question is, have you heard of Manfred Max Neef and his story about the mosquito the swarm of mosquitoes that's able to bring down the rhinoceros because there's no leader, there's no head. It is like the leader-full, true grassroots movement that you describe, and it's a wonderful story.
I've always loved the other metaphor of mosquito, which is, you know, you can be a very small NGO, but it's the mosquito in the dark strategy, which is, you've ever gone to bed with one mosquito in your room, you know, and you can't go to sleep, keeps landing in your ear. And so small things can have a huge impact.
Okay, next question.
Hi, my name's Paul. Sorry, my name's Honor. So, Paul, question for you. I wish I was Paul.
That was you, Honor. I was thinking,
it's a good name.
Maybe
you can have it.
Maybe it's not him after all.
I didn't know I had so much influence.
I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah.
What will the day in the life of me or anyone here look like in the future? What will our lifestyles look like? Obviously, reducing our energy and bringing forth alternative energy is one thing that we need to address, but the way we live is something. What I'm noticing is collaborative consumption and, say, urban farming are big trends that are coming through. What else? Will it be like a 4-day working week? What other kind of ways will we be living? I hope that.
Yeah, one of the things I try not to do is predict, because it's a sure way of being wrong, and often, you know, I'm wrong anyway. So I mean, that's like tempting fate. And I worked at Stanford Research Institute, and we did a lot of futures work, future scenarios, writing for governments and big corporations, and the one thing we learned is that whatever we predicted, we knew that would not happen. We guaranteed that would not occur in terms of scenario. And so I would ask you to go back 10 or 15 years and ask yourself if anybody did predict what it's like to live right now. And no one did. And it wasn't that long. So I would say that the future is going to be stunningly surprising to all of us. and all levels. And I don't say that like good or bad, just in the sense of the rate of change is accelerating. And the question is, will the rate of adaptation accelerate, you know? And even going back, you know, to the gainsayers, you know, I want to say something about that, which is, this is humanity, and we really are we. Those people who heckle and challenge and, you know, science or climate, they have a role to play. Because if you're not clear, you know, in your understanding and your knowledge, they'll take it apart, and that's a service. And if you are, and you're clear about it, and you've done your homework, then it's okay, you know. So even those people who are doing their best, you know, to be golems, to be outside and so forth, and try to, you know, harm and destroy, you know, and make fun and ridicule and us, they have a role to play too. It's okay. They're part of humanity. They've always been there. And they always will be. And so we can embrace them. And they don't know what to do when you embrace them.
Okay, one at this side, to the left.
My name's James, and thanks very much for your talk today. I'm really interested in what you said about overcoming our separation from nature and the way that we see ourselves. And I've sort of got two questions. One is about how do we help make that really important spiritual sort of transformation that I think we've got to make. But on the other hand, there's some positives I see in the way that we've made that separation. There's sort of like the difference between objectivity and subjectivity in a way, and you know, which has been a key theme in our enlightenment over the years, but that's also got a lot of negatives in it too. But I also like the example you gave about the difference between the city and the corporation which seems to fit more neatly with natural principles as we might think of them, but is doing a lot of harm, and the city which is sort of turning those natural principles on their end, but which you see as having a lot of hope in it. So it's a question about how do we find the good things about what is, you know, man-made that are going to help us to the future,
yes,
while also, you know, we're at the same time we're transcending those natural principles in a way. There's a sort of balancing act we've got to do there. So I'm interested in how do we, one, make that transformation, and how do we keep that balance in a positive way at the same time.
Yeah,
and I hate to say it, you'll have to be very quick.
I very much agree with you about the Enlightenment, about the, you know, the Western tradition has so much value to bring, and I'm not talking about abandoning that in face of some sort of spiritual healing, which I highly advocate as well. It's really the two coming together where the power rests and so forth. And I would hope that, you know, that no matter anything I've said tonight or today actually is not about creating more separation or divisiveness. It's not my intention anyway. And to the degree to which I may have, you know, I apologize. I regret that, because that is not my role or not my goal as a human being.
How do we bring those together? It's really my question. How do we transcend that potential divide?
I think we are. I think that's exactly what we're doing. That's exactly what's happening, and that's why I think our role is to, you know, and this is what's so wonderful about Australia, and I know we're running out of time, but I mean, it's 4 o'clock, but, you know, is this just, it's a simple acknowledgement before every talk and event and so forth to the lands of those peoples to whom we are blessed to occupy and to convene upon, is such a simple gesture, but that's part of that healing, part of that coming together, part of that acknowledgement. You know, we're not putting ourselves down, you know, but we're putting all of ourselves up and exalting who we are. And so, you know, that's the healing journey. Yeah.
Well, Paul Hawken, thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your marvellous thoughts with all of us. A big hand to Paul Hawken.